let's get into the story. Caroline Raymond's mornings always began before the town fully woke. She arranged bolts of fabric beneath a faded awning on Alder Street, her fingers moving with practiced care as she smoothed silk, linen, and cotton into neat displays. The stall was small, but it was hers, built from years of discipline, quiet sacrifice, and a refusal to depend on anyone else. Caroline was known not for beauty alone, but for her firmness of character. She spoke politely, worked relentlessly, and never encouraged flirtation or pity. In a town that measured success by status and spectacle, she believed dignity was earned through consistency, not applause. People talked about her when they thought she couldn't hear. They wondered why a woman with steady income and calm intelligence remained unmarried. Some assumed she was proud, others said she was afraid. The truth was simpler. Caroline valued peace over performance. She had watched relationships crumble under greed, expectations, and public pressure. Her parents, though loving, often reminded her that time was passing and choices were narrowing. She listened respectfully but held her ground. Marriage, to her, was not an escape, it was a partnership that demanded honesty and shared values. That same morning, as sunlight cut through the narrow street, Caroline noticed a man struggling near the curb. He moved slowly, supported by worn crutches, his posture rigid with effort rather than weakness. Passers-by avoided him, pretending urgency. Caroline hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, offering quiet help without drawing attention. He thanked her with a reserved nod, his eyes steady, proud, and strangely composed. She didn't know his name then, only that something about his restraint and self-respect lingered with her long after he disappeared into the crowd. Unbeknownst to Caroline, that small act of courtesy had just placed her at the beginning of a path that would challenge everything she believed about truth, love, and choice. Jacob Reed lived on the edge of town, where old brick buildings leaned slightly as if tired of standing. His rented room was clean, sparse, and deliberately modest, containing only what he needed: a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a shelf of well-worn books. Each morning, he strapped his braces carefully and reached for his crutches with practiced calm. His movements were slow but controlled, never theatrical. What struck most people was not his condition, but his refusal to invite sympathy. Jacob neither complained nor explained. He simply endured. The town had already decided who he was. To them, Jacob was unfortunate, poor, and forgettable. Shopkeepers spoke to him briefly, if at all. Children stared, then whispered. Adults avoided eye contact, as if disability were contagious. Jacob noticed everything, but he carried himself with quiet dignity, responding with courtesy and restraint. He spent his days repairing small items for neighbors who couldn't afford proper services, earning just enough to survive. At night, he read and wrote, filling notebooks with thoughts about character, integrity, and the cost of deception. When Caroline helped him that morning, Jacob felt something unfamiliar, not gratitude alone, but recognition. She had not rushed, pitied, or drawn attention. She treated him as capable, not fragile. From a distance, he watched her return to her fabric stall, her posture straight, her expression calm despite the noise around her. Jacob knew then that she was different. What he did not yet know was how deeply their lives would soon intertwine, nor how severely the truth he guarded would one day test both of them. The next time Caroline saw Jacob, it was raining lightly, the kind of rain that blurred edges and softened the town's sharp judgments. She was closing her stall early when she noticed him struggling to steady a bundle of repaired goods under his arm. Without a word, she stepped out from beneath her awning and offered him a spare cloth to shield his work. Their exchange was brief, practical, and unembellished, yet it carried a subtle ease that surprised them both. Jacob thanked her again, this time introducing himself. Caroline did the same, their names settling comfortably between them. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed more often, though never by design. Jacob stopped near her stall to rest, always at a respectful distance. Caroline occasionally saved scraps of fabric for him, useful for repairs. They spoke of ordinary things, the weather, books, the pace of town life, careful not to intrude on each other's private worlds. Caroline noticed Jacob's precision in speech, the way he listened fully before responding. Jacob, in turn, admired her independence and the calm authority with which she managed both customers and critics. Whispers followed them. Some wondered why Caroline wasted time on a man with nothing to offer. Others speculated about hidden motives. Caroline ignored them, choosing instead to trust her own observations. Jacob never asked for favors, never leaned on her kindness. Their connection grew not from romance, but from mutual respect. Neither of them realized that this quiet crossing, built on patience and restraint, was laying the foundation for a bond strong enough to withstand judgment, deception, and a truth that would soon shake the town to its core. It didn't take long for the town to notice the pattern. Caroline Raymond, the fabric seller who kept her life neatly folded and private, was now often seen speaking with Jacob Reed. At first, the gossip was casual, almost amused. People laughed it off as charity or boredom. But as the days passed and the exchanges continued, the tone shifted. Whispers sharpened into opinions, and opinions hardened into judgment. By the time Caroline noticed the change, the town had already written its own version of her story. Customers began to linger at her stall longer than necessary, their compliments edged with curiosity. Some asked innocent-sounding questions about Jacob, masking ridicule behind concern. Others were more direct, warning her with forced kindness that she was too young or too capable to tie herself to a man who would only slow her down. Caroline listened without argument, her expression unreadable. She had learned early that defending herself against rumor only fed it. Silence, she believed, was stronger. Jacob felt the shift as well. He noticed conversations stop when he entered a space, laughter resuming only after he passed. A few acquaintances stopped bringing him small repair jobs, afraid association might reflect poorly on them. Still, he carried on as before, refusing to alter his routine. What unsettled him was not the gossip itself, but the realization that Caroline was now its target because of him. He considered distancing himself, sparing her the scrutiny, but every time he saw her steady gaze, he hesitated. One evening, as the town square buzzed with speculation, Caroline made a choice without announcing it. She invited Jacob to sit beside her stall, openly, in full view of everyone passing by. She offered him water, spoke to him as she always had, and continued her work unbothered. The message was clear, even without words. For the first time, the gossip paused, not because it had ended, but because the town realized Caroline Raymond was not afraid of it. Caroline's decision did not go unnoticed by her family. That evening, when she returned home, the atmosphere was heavier than usual. Her mother moved quietly around the kitchen, avoiding direct questions, while her father sat stiffly at the table, his concern written plainly across his face. They had heard the rumors, not from strangers, but from relatives and neighbors who spoke as if they were offering protection. To them, the town's judgment felt less like cruelty and more like a warning. Her father spoke first, carefully choosing his words. He reminded Caroline of her independence, of how hard she had worked to build a life that required no rescue. He asked what future she imagined with a man who, by all appearances, struggled just to stand. Her mother worried aloud about loneliness, about illness, about a lifetime of responsibility that would fall solely on Caroline's shoulders. Their fear was not malicious, it was practical, rooted in love and social reality. Caroline listened without interruption. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but resolute. She explained that Jacob had never asked her for anything, that he treated her with respect and honesty. She told them she was not seeking perfection, only alignment of values. Love, she said, was not a transaction of advantages but a shared commitment to dignity. Her parents exchanged uneasy glances, unconvinced but unable to deny her clarity. That night, Caroline lay awake, aware that she had crossed an invisible line. The town might gossip, but family resistance cut deeper. Still, she felt no regret. For the first time, she understood that choosing her own path would require not just independence, but courage. And she was prepared to carry that weight, even if she had to do so alone. The next morning, Jacob sensed the tension before Caroline said a word. She greeted him with the same courtesy, yet there was a heaviness beneath her calm. As they spoke near the edge of the market, he noticed how carefully she chose her words, as though weighing each one before letting it go. When she finally mentioned her parents' concerns, Jacob did not react with defensiveness or wounded pride. Instead, he listened, his expression thoughtful, his posture steady despite the strain of standing. He told her, without embellishment, that he understood their fears. He spoke of responsibility not as a burden, but as a choice that must be made freely. He assured her that he would never trap her with obligation or guilt, never ask her to sacrifice her future for his sake. If she chose to walk away, he said, he would respect that decision completely. His voice held no bitterness, only certainty. For Caroline, this restraint spoke louder than promises ever could. As days passed, Jacob revealed more of himself, not secrets, but principles. He spoke of discipline, of holding oneself accountable even when no one was watching. He shared his belief that character was proven under pressure, not comfort. Caroline noticed how he treated everyone the same, regardless of how they treated him. There was no performance in his kindness, no need to impress. It was simply who he was. Caroline found herself drawn not by pity or defiance, but by trust. Jacob never rushed her, never implied expectation. In a town obsessed with appearances, his quiet consistency felt rare. What neither of them acknowledged aloud was that something irreversible was taking shape between them, something built not on illusion or convenience, but on values that would soon be tested in ways neither could yet imagine. It began with a presence rather than a conversation. Caroline first noticed the woman near her stall one afternoon when the market was unusually quiet. She stood apart from the crowd, dressed simply but with unmistakable refinement, her posture composed, her gaze observant. Unlike others, she did not stare openly or whisper. She watched with intent, as though studying a pattern only she could see. When their eyes met, the woman offered a polite nod and nothing more. The following day, the woman returned. This time, she approached Caroline's stall and examined the fabrics with careful hands. Her questions were precise, her voice calm, carrying an authority that did not need to announce itself. She introduced herself as Madame Sandra. Before Caroline could ask more, she glanced briefly in Jacob's direction, who sat nearby, unaware of the attention. There was something weighted in her expression, recognition, perhaps, or concern carefully concealed. Madame Sandra's words were measured, almost gentle. She praised Caroline's work ethic, her composure, and her independence. Then, without explanation, she offered a warning cloaked as advice. She suggested that some truths, when hidden too long, could wound even the strongest hearts. She urged Caroline to be cautious with choices that seemed noble but were built on incomplete knowledge. When Caroline pressed for clarity, Madame Sandra smiled faintly and changed the subject, completing her purchase before leaving as quietly as she had come. Caroline stood unsettled long after the woman disappeared into the crowd. There had been no accusation, no threat, only a sense of being observed by someone who knew more than she revealed. Jacob noticed her distraction later and asked if something was wrong. Caroline shook her head, unsure how to explain a feeling she couldn't yet define. What she didn't realize was that Madame Sandra's appearance marked the beginning of a countdown, one that would soon pull hidden truths into the open, whether anyone was ready or not. The tension that had been simmering finally surfaced during the town's annual trade gathering, a crowded afternoon meant for networking and celebration. Caroline attended out of obligation, setting up a modest display of her fabrics among louder, flashier stalls. Jacob arrived later, positioning himself at the edge of the square where he could observe without drawing attention. Almost immediately, the energy around them shifted. Conversations stalled, glances multiplied, and smiles took on a cruel edge. Someone laughed too loudly. Another muttered a comment that was meant to be overheard. The ridicule was no longer subtle. A group of traders openly questioned Caroline's judgment, disguising insults as jokes. They spoke about sacrifice, about wasted potential, about charity mistaken for love. One voice suggested she enjoyed being admired for her kindness, implying her choice was performative rather than sincere. Caroline felt the weight of every word, not because they were true, but because they were designed to wound. She kept her composure, refusing to argue or explain, but her silence only emboldened them. What no one expected was Jacob's response. He did not confront the crowd or raise his voice. Instead, he quietly gathered his crutches and moved away from the square, removing himself from the spectacle entirely. The gesture was deliberate, not submissive. Caroline understood immediately. He was protecting her, refusing to let her dignity be further tested on his account. As she watched him go, something in her hardened. The laughter faded behind her, replaced by resolve. She packed her fabrics early and followed him, knowing that from this point forward, neutrality was no longer an option. The evening after the trade gathering was unusually still. The town, so loud in its opinions during the day, seemed to retreat into itself at night. Caroline found Jacob sitting near the old footbridge, a place rarely used, where the river moved steadily without spectacle. He looked smaller there, not because of weakness, but because the space stripped away the noise that usually surrounded him. When she approached, he did not apologize for leaving the square earlier, nor did he explain. He simply acknowledged her presence, as if he had been expecting her. Jacob spoke slowly, choosing honesty over drama. He told her he had no illusions about how the town saw him or how association with him would continue to cost her. He admitted that walking away that afternoon was his way of drawing a line between spectacle and sincerity. Then, without kneeling or ceremony, he asked her a question that startled her in its simplicity. He asked if she would consider marrying him, not as a rescue or rebellion, but as a conscious decision to build a life grounded in respect and restraint. There were no promises of ease, no declarations of destiny. Jacob did not speak of forever or happiness guaranteed. Instead, he promised transparency in all things that mattered, loyalty without possession, and partnership without domination. Caroline felt the weight of the moment not because of romance, but because of clarity. She asked for time, not to escape, but to be certain. Jacob accepted her answer without disappointment. As they parted that night, Caroline realized something irreversible had occurred, not the proposal itself, but the fact that she was now choosing deliberately, fully aware that whatever came next would demand strength she had never before been required to use. Caroline did not answer Jacob immediately, and the town felt that hesitation like a held breath. Word of the proposal spread faster than truth ever did, distorted with every retelling. By morning, some said she had already accepted, others claimed she was being pressured, and a few insisted the engagement was proof that she had always wanted attention. Caroline stayed silent, returning to her stall with the same composure she always carried, though inwardly her thoughts were restless. She weighed not only her feelings for Jacob, but the life that would follow any decision she made. At home, the pressure intensified. Her parents spoke more urgently now, no longer circling their concerns. They reminded her of long-term realities, medical care, social isolation, the emotional labor of being strong for two people. Friends she trusted urged caution, insisting love alone could not sustain a marriage built under constant scrutiny. Caroline listened to every voice, but she measured each opinion against Jacob's actions, not his circumstances. She remembered how he stepped away from ridicule without bitterness, how he offered commitment without coercion. When Caroline finally sought Jacob out again, it was not to seek reassurance, but to speak plainly. She told him she would not marry out of defiance or sympathy, nor would she rush to prove anything to anyone. She needed to know that whatever path they chose would be rooted in truth, not endurance alone. Jacob agreed without hesitation. He told her he would rather wait indefinitely than bind her to a life she did not choose freely. In that moment, Caroline understood that her answer, whatever it would be, would define not just her future, but the terms by which she allowed herself to be known. The church was full long before the ceremony was meant to begin. People arrived early, not out of support, but curiosity. The wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of expectation, whispers moving faster than the slow organ music meant to calm the room. Caroline stood at the front, her hands steady, her breathing measured. She had chosen simplicity for this day, not because she lacked options, but because she wanted nothing to distract from the seriousness of the choice she was making. She was not smiling, not anxious, only resolved. Whatever happened next, she would meet it with clarity. When the doors at the back of the church opened, the room stilled. Heads turned in unison, prepared to witness the familiar sight of Jacob Reed advancing carefully on his crutches. What followed instead fractured the silence. Jacob stepped forward without support, his stride even, unhurried, unmistakably strong. Gasps rippled through the congregation, disbelief spreading like a shockwave. Some stood halfway from their seats. Others covered their mouths. Caroline felt the moment before she fully saw it, an instinctive tightening in her chest, as if the air itself had changed. Before Jacob could speak, Madame Sandra rose from her seat. Her presence, composed and commanding, cut through the confusion. She introduced herself not as an observer, but as his mother. She spoke calmly, explaining that Jacob had never been disabled, that his poverty and condition had been constructed as a test, one meant to reveal truth in a world obsessed with appearances. She named him heir to a vast estate, a fortune hidden deliberately until this moment. The church buzzed with awe, greed, and sudden admiration. Jacob finally looked at Caroline, his expression open, expectant. But Caroline did not mirror the amazement around her. She felt no triumph, no relief, only betrayal. The revelation did not feel like a gift, but a theft of agency. By choosing secrecy, Jacob had decided for her what she could endure, what humiliation she would accept. Slowly, deliberately, Caroline stepped back. The room fell silent again as she spoke, her voice steady but firm. She told him wealth revealed too late was still deception. And with that, she turned and walked away, alone, leaving the church suspended in a truth no one had prepared for. The church remained frozen long after Caroline's footsteps faded down the aisle. What had been anticipation transformed into confusion, then embarrassment. People avoided one another's eyes, unsure whether to feel triumphant at the revelation of wealth or ashamed of how quickly their loyalty had shifted. Jacob stood where he was, the space beside him painfully empty. For the first time since stepping through those doors without his crutches, he felt exposed rather than empowered. The truth he had believed would secure certainty had instead dismantled it. Outside, Caroline walked with no destination in mind, her breath shallow but controlled. She did not cry. What ached was not heartbreak alone, but the realization that her endurance had been used as part of an experiment she never consented to join. Every insult she had absorbed, every warning she had dismissed, now carried new weight. The humiliation had been avoidable. The choice had been taken from her. That knowledge cut deeper than any insult ever could. Behind her, the town began to recalibrate. Admiration replaced mockery with alarming speed. People whispered about missed opportunities, about how brave Jacob must have been, about how foolish Caroline was to walk away from fortune. None of it reached her. She returned to her fabric stall the next morning as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The fabrics were the same. Her routine was unchanged. But beneath the surface, something had shifted irrevocably. Caroline Raymond was no longer reacting to the town's judgment. She was redefining herself beyond it. By the second week after the failed wedding, the town's tone had changed completely. The same people who once laughed openly now greeted Caroline with exaggerated warmth. Compliments replaced insults, and invitations appeared where there had once been avoidance. Some spoke as if they had always supported her, as if their earlier warnings had been concern rather than judgment. Caroline accepted none of it. She responded with courtesy but offered no access to her inner world. Respect, she understood now, was meaningless when it arrived only after wealth was revealed. Jacob withdrew from public view. The fortune announced so dramatically became real overnight. Properties reclaimed, accounts unlocked, doors opened without resistance. Yet the privilege felt hollow. He had expected relief, perhaps even admiration, but instead found himself confronting the cost of his deception. Madame Sandra urged patience, insisting that time would soften Caroline's stance. Jacob refused to hide behind his mother's influence. For the first time, he questioned whether the test he had designed revealed truth, or merely exposed his own fear of being chosen without conditions. Caroline, meanwhile, redirected her focus inward and outward at once. She expanded her fabric stall into a small workshop, inviting local women to learn skills that offered independence rather than dependency. The work grounded her, reminding her that dignity was built through effort, not inheritance. Jacob quietly funded the materials without announcing his involvement, respecting the distance she had asked for. Their lives ran parallel, no longer intertwined, yet undeniably connected by a truth still unfolding. Jacob's return to public life did not bring the ease everyone expected. Meetings replaced silence, documents replaced rumors, and names he had not heard in years resurfaced with sudden familiarity. With wealth came exposure, and with exposure came questions he could no longer avoid. Among them was the construction accident Madame Sandra had quietly buried years ago, an incident Jacob had known of but never confronted directly. What had once been hidden behind influence now demanded accountability. Jacob made the decision to face it openly, knowing it would stain the polished image the town was eager to celebrate. Madame Sandra opposed him at first, urging discretion, warning him of consequences that could ripple through their family name. For the first time, Jacob stood firm against her authority. He explained that the deception he had used to test love had cost him the very thing he sought. He would not repeat that mistake by hiding again. Legal processes began, uncomfortable truths surfaced, and admiration from the town cooled into wary respect. Jacob accepted it without complaint. This, he believed, was the price of living without disguise. Caroline heard of his actions indirectly, through fragmented conversations and reluctant admissions from townspeople who no longer knew how to speak about either of them. She did not reach out, nor did she condemn him. Instead, she watched from a distance, allowing actions, not apologies, to shape her understanding. The wound was still there, but beneath it was a growing awareness. Jacob was no longer testing character. He was finally living in alignment with it. Time passed without announcements or confrontations. Caroline's workshop grew steadily, not through donations or influence, but through consistent work and quiet word of mouth. Women who once pitied her now sought her guidance, drawn by the stability she had built from refusal rather than compromise. Caroline taught without preaching, correcting without belittling. Her life regained rhythm, and within that rhythm, her sense of self strengthened. She did not speak Jacob's name, yet she did not erase him either. Jacob remained true to his resolve. He did not attempt grand gestures or public apologies. Instead, he ensured the workshop had resources, paid anonymously, deliberately removing his identity from the process. He spent his time navigating legal consequences, repairing relationships fractured by secrecy, and learning how to exist without a role to hide behind. For the first time, he lived visibly, without disguise or performance. The town, once so eager to claim him, now watched from a respectful distance. Though they did not meet, their choices echoed each other. Caroline's independence and Jacob's accountability became parallel acts of restoration. Neither sought reunion, neither demanded closure. What formed between them was not longing, but recognition, a silent understanding that love, if it were to return, would have to arrive uninvited, honest, and untested. Their paths crossed again not by design, but by inevitability. It happened at the edge of town, near the workshop's supply entrance, where deliveries arrived early and left quietly. Jacob was there to finalize paperwork with a vendor, his presence unannounced and unembellished. When Caroline saw him, there was no shock, only a pause. Neither smiled. Neither turned away. The moment was free of spectacle, and because of that, it carried weight. They spoke without rehearsed lines. Jacob did not begin with apology, nor did Caroline demand one. He spoke instead of responsibility, of learning that truth delayed was still harm, even when intentions were pure. He admitted that his test had been rooted in fear, fear of being chosen for the wrong reasons, fear of vulnerability without control. Caroline listened, not defensively, but attentively. When she responded, she spoke of consent, of the right to choose fully informed, and of how endurance without agency was not virtue. The conversation ended without promises. There was no decision, no rekindling. But something essential shifted. They had met each other without illusions, no disguises, no expectations. As they parted, Caroline realized the anger she had carried was loosening, replaced by clarity. Jacob, in turn, understood that love could not be proven through trials, only through truth sustained over time. What followed their conversation was not reunion, but patience. Caroline did not change her routine, nor did Jacob attempt to insert himself back into her life. Yet there was a subtle difference in how the town perceived them. They were no longer a scandal or a cautionary tale, but two individuals moving deliberately forward. Caroline continued expanding her workshop, introducing new designs and techniques that reflected her growing confidence. Each piece of fabric carried intention, not display. Jacob focused on restoring what could be repaired. He settled legal matters transparently and restructured his inheritance so it reflected accountability rather than entitlement. He took on projects that required long-term commitment instead of immediate praise, learning the discipline of consistency without recognition. In doing so, he discovered a version of himself that did not rely on concealment or control. This was not redemption in the public sense, it was quieter, more demanding. Months later, Jacob reached out again, not with a proposal or request, but an invitation to speak, without expectation. Caroline accepted on her terms. Their meeting was brief, calm, and grounded in mutual respect. They discussed work, values, and boundaries, not emotions. Trust, they agreed, would have to be built differently this time, without tests, without secrets, and without fear of walking away if alignment failed. Their renewed connection unfolded slowly, shaped by intention rather than momentum. Caroline and Jacob met in open spaces, parks, quiet streets, shared work settings, never behind closed doors, never under assumptions. Each conversation added clarity rather than confusion. Caroline asked questions she once would have avoided, and Jacob answered without hesitation, even when the truth was uncomfortable. There were no rehearsed narratives, no softened edges. What existed between them was choice, renewed daily. The town watched but no longer interfered. Familiar voices that once shaped opinion had lost their authority. Caroline no longer measured herself against expectation, and Jacob no longer feared visibility. Their interactions were not romantic in the traditional sense. They were deliberate, grounded, and respectful. Caroline noticed that Jacob never assumed forgiveness. He allowed her space to lead, to pause, to redirect. That restraint mattered more than declarations ever could. One afternoon, beneath a wide tree at the edge of a field, Caroline spoke first. She said she no longer felt trapped by what had happened, but she also refused to erase it. Jacob agreed. They acknowledged that what lay ahead would not be restoration of the past, but creation of something new. When Jacob asked, quietly, if she would consider marriage again, there was no audience, no urgency, no promise of reward. Caroline did not answer immediately. But this time, her hesitation carried peace rather than doubt. Caroline took time after Jacob's question, not because she feared the answer, but because she respected its weight. 4 days, she moved through her routine with renewed awareness, examining not Jacob's actions alone, but her own readiness. She thought about the life she had built independently, the strength she had gained by walking away, and the clarity that had followed. Marriage, she knew now, was not a rescue, nor a reward. It was a decision that had to honor who she had become. When she finally responded, it was on neutral ground, without witnesses or ceremony. Caroline told Jacob she would choose him again, not because he had changed his circumstances, but because he had changed his approach to truth. She made it clear that this choice came with conditions of transparency, equality, and shared responsibility. Jacob accepted without negotiation. He did not frame her decision as forgiveness granted, but as trust offered, something to be protected, not assumed. They agreed to marry quietly, without public validation or spectacle. The town was informed after the fact, not invited to interpret or approve. For Caroline, the peace she felt was not excitement, but alignment. She had chosen freely, with full knowledge and full agency. And in doing so, she reclaimed the narrative of her life, on her own terms. The morning of their wedding arrived without fanfare. No church bells rang, no crowds gathered, and no curious eyes waited to witness a transformation. Caroline and Jacob met beneath a broad, quiet tree just beyond the town's edge, where the air felt open and unclaimed. The setting was intentional, neutral ground, untouched by judgment or history. Caroline wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, every stitch deliberate. Jacob stood beside her without symbols of status, only presence. What mattered here was not what had been revealed in the past, but what was being chosen now. There were few words spoken. No vows filled with grand promises, no declarations meant for memory or applause. Instead, they spoke plainly about commitment, honesty, and the understanding that love was not possession, performance, or proof. They acknowledged what had broken before and what had been rebuilt differently. Each sentence carried weight because nothing was hidden behind it. When they joined hands, it was not an act of triumph, but of alignment, two people meeting as equals, fully seen. Afterward, life continued without disruption. Caroline returned to her workshop, expanding it into a lasting space of independence and skill. Jacob remained involved, not as benefactor, but as partner, respecting boundaries and shared vision. The town adjusted slowly, deprived of spectacle but forced to accept reality. What endured was not the story they once provided for others, but the life they now lived quietly together. Their beginning was not defined by revelation or wealth, but by choice reclaimed. And in that choice, made without pressure, without disguise, and without fear, Caroline and Jacob found something stronger than romance, a future built on truth. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.